Well, good afternoon, West in the world. It is Thursday, February the 4th, and this week in class we've been talking about the Protestant Reformation and the era of Catholic reform, this major period of upheaval in the life of Christianity in its Western expression, at least. On Tuesday, we started to sort of lay out the basic parameters for the dispute that became the Protestant Reformation, and concentrated closely on the life of Martin Luther and how his own sort of personal quest for spiritual security and assuredness eventually produced a much larger movement rebelling against the authority of the Church in Rome. Then today we turned our attention to the question of how that movement became a fractured one that expressed itself in a variety of different ways: Anabaptism, Calvinism, the Church of England, as well as then the sort of Catholic response to all of these things. And obviously all those things are critically important, and I don't want to try to repeat everything that I said in class in this video, so let me just try to highlight a few things that in my mind sort of stand out from this discussion. First of all, I think it's important to be able to identify those things that unify Protestants. And we said that there are sort of three theological concepts and two, I guess, practical actions that distinguish Protestants from Catholics. That is to say, the principles of sola fides, salvation by faith alone, sola scriptura, scripture alone as authority, and the notion of the priesthood of all believers that have this direct access to God. These are the three unifying theological distinctives of the Protestant tradition. And then with that there is the movement from 7 sacraments down to 2, just the principles or the ideas of the Eucharist and baptism as the sacraments of the Protestant tradition. Those things are points of unity, but as we saw, of course, there are many, many things that end up separating them in terms of theological or other kinds of distinctive qualities. I think another thing that I would emphasize is the way in which the Protestant Reformation is linked with the attitudes, the sort of humanist attitudes of the people we talked about in the context of the Italian Renaissance. I hope that you can see that there is a connection between the way that Luther and the Protestants handled Scripture, their desire to sort of recover this ancient text, to read it for themselves and apply it to their own times, that is deeply related, deeply embedded in this idea of the humanists like Lorenzo Valla, who would go back and study the texts of ancient Rome and of ancient Greece, which were basically texts generated contemporary with the biblical text, and apply them to their own, generally more secular, questions about the world. The last thing that I think I would try to emphasize about this larger context was the point that we mostly tried to emphasize today, which is about the evolution of the relationship between the church and the state. Protestantism in many ways brings religion more closely, ties religion more closely to the realm of the political than had been the case in Europe before. Not to say that the church in Rome wasn't political. It very much was, but it stood in some ways outside as its own kind of contender, because the Pope was very much a political figure, just as he was a spiritual one. But now, with Protestantism, you have political rulers of different principalities and kingdoms who also are trying to assume authority over churches. And what we're going to see as we move from the wars of religion to the era of state building and absolute monarchy is that that concentration of power in the hands of political rulers is going to produce a new set of problems, a new dynamic in Western life, that's going to open up a whole new set of questions and disputes that we'll be focusing on in the days ahead. So, looking forward to having those conversations with you starting next week. Have a good weekend. See you on Tuesday.